This chapter gets interesting as it discusses some of the more practical manipulations of the economy by our government. What the text is hoping to do with the prior two chapters is to impress you with how smart the folks at the Federal Reserve are at predicting how the economy will go with the aggregate expenditures model and the aggregate demand and supply, when in truth, they're generally as clueless as the rest of us are. The text identifies fiscal policy as the practice of either stimulating the economy or reining in inflation. In truth, the government has been on a non-stop spending spree since the end of the Second World War. There are some economists that say that all of the stimulus payments during the pandemic is partly to blame for the hyperinflation that we are experiencing today. So why in the world would we be talking about yet another stimulus to help people deal with their higher fuel costs? The primary goal of the President's Council of Economic Advisors is to set the nation's current fiscal policy. In the current administration, the three economists appointed to the council are Cecilia Elena Rouse, who's the chair, Jared Bernstein, and Heather Bushy. Cecilia Rouse is the first African American woman to hold the chair of the CEA and has served the CEA as a member in both the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations. As a member of the faculty at Princeton University, Ms. Rouse has focused her research and publications on studying the economic impact of expanded education as a means of building up America's overall economy. Jared Bernstein has also focused his career on the problem of opening up educational opportunities, especially for minority students. Heather Bushy is also a strong liberal within the CEA who generally favors progressive taxation and expanded educational opportunities for minorities. On the downside, President Biden's liberal CEA is seen as generally in favor of more free trade, which we have seen can be extremely detrimental to domestic economic output, as large manufacturing enterprises generally take advantage of open borders to seek cheaper labor outside of the U.S. So far, it seems like this very liberal CEA has done more to drive up inflation rather than anything else. But we'll try to keep an open mind as to whether they'll be able to affect aggregate demand through additional spending on education, free trade, and climate change. The one thing that we can be sure of is that when the government is in stimulus mode, the national deficit increases. A deficit is the condition where the government spends more money than it takes in with tax revenues. As of this recording in August 2022, the government is running a $1.5 trillion deficit, which is below the pandemic levels, but still quite high. This has pushed the total public debt to over 134% of GDP, but I'll talk about more of that later. The text also goes on into the definition of a contractionary fiscal policy, but it's not really worth spending a lot of time talking about that because, as I've already mentioned, the United States has been operating under an expansionary policy since the end of the Civil War. But Mr. G, you may ask, didn't we briefly experience a budget surplus in the late 1990s under President Clinton? That's true, but it wasn't the result of a contractionary policy. It was more the result of the end of the Cold War, which led to a massive reduction in military spending for a brief period of time. Then we experienced the 9/11 terror attacks, and that ended that brief military holiday, and we have been expanding our military ever since. Now I wish to address the myth of the built-in stability in our economy. This is the dogma that states that since the government has the ability to tax its own citizens, and since most of the financed debt of the country is held by Americans, and that since the government has the ability to print its own money anytime it sees fit, then the country can never go bankrupt. This is simply not true. Worse, this lie is repeated over and over again so that the people of this country won't question as to why the government can continue to spend money it doesn't have on things that do little to promote the general welfare of the people. Even if Biden's liberal CEA is successful at convincing Congress to spend more on education, that budget item will still pale in comparison to defense spending, which is currently at over $755 trillion. Allow me to address all three dogma items of the built-in stability myth. Number one, the government has the ability to tax its own citizens to pay for the debt. As of this recording, the current per taxpayer burden of the national debt is $244,315. The last time I checked, I didn't have that much money sitting in my bank account, and even if I did, I think I would be pretty pissed off if the government decided to take that from me. Myth number two. Most of the U.S. debt is held by Americans. The U.S. debt is held in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds. Bonds can be bought and sold on the open market, and is often that has a market values greater than their stated or par or face value. Therefore, debt equals wealth. There is three problems with this line of thinking. Number one, about 30% of the U.S. debt in this country is held by foreign governments and foreign corporations, in particular China. Number two, if the government can no longer afford to pay the interest on the bonds, then their market values will fall. This has already happened in other parts of the world. Number three, the Federal Reserve is now purchasing 90% of the new issuances of government debt using newly printed money. This works fine as long as the dollar remains the reserve currency of the world, but when it comes crashing down, it won't be. Myth number three, the government can simply print more money to pay off the debt. This is the most ridiculous argument of all, but one that is often repeated. What do you think would happen to price levels in this country if the government suddenly flooded $20 trillion into the money supply? Argentina tried that in the 1980s, and Zimbabwe tried that in the early 2000s. The German Weimar Republic tried that in 1935, and look what happened to them. While the stimulus payments to Americans during the pandemic did cost trillions funded by newly printed money, it still pales in comparison to the $17 trillion of the Wall Street bailout of 2009. The big difference is that the banks tended to hold on to that money while taxpayers tended to spend that money. This means that now we have a lot more money in the money supply, which explains why inflation is as crazy as it is right now. The simple truth is that fiscal policy is a very complicated business, and anyone telling you that they have the answer is simply blowing smoke. What seems to be clear is that the government is not doing a very good job, but it's not all their fault. Even if there was universal agreement on a course of action, there's still a recognition lag where they have to recognize there's a problem in the first place. There's an administrative lag where it takes time for Congress to actually hammer out a bill that they can all agree on. And then there's the operational lag where it takes time to build the infrastructure in order to enforce the new law. Then there are political considerations. For example, any politician who advocates the raising of taxes will probably not get reelected as the politician who advocates on any restrictions on large corporate interests. Even if one administration is successful in passing legislation to address fiscal problems, the next administration is going to come along and reverse it before it has a chance to see any new results. All of this spending without actually doing anything puts the United States in a very dangerous position when it comes to the national debt. In the chart here, we're going to ignore figure 13.6 in the text. We see the Congressional Budget Office's projection of the national debt as a percentage of GDP. The idea is that as long as the debt is less than 100% of GDP, the country is technically solvent. According to the CBO, the debt to GDP ratio exceeded 100% at the start of the pandemic and is projected to climb exponentially into the future, with the debt to reach 202% of GDP by 2051. Yes, the country is now insolvent. The bottom line is you should ignore the false concern section of your textbook. It's just propaganda designed to make you feel better about our debt situation when the math is pretty simple. Like my dad would tell me when I was a teenager, when your expenses are more than your income, then your upkeep becomes your downfall. Let us end this depressing discussion on fiscal policy by addressing the crowding out effect. What this is suggesting is that the more government pays in terms of basic infrastructure services, the private sector will choose then to ignore. The logical conclusion is that if the government spends less on such things as art, education, energy, and roads, then more likely that private industry will come along and pick up the slack. Some would argue that this would be a good thing because private companies are driven by competition, and that competition will result in improved services at a lower cost. This assumption is flawed for several reasons. Number one, it assumes that a market exists for things like energy, roads, and other basic infrastructure, when in fact, no such market actually exists. Customers are limited to one or two electricity providers, one or two gas providers. A road is a public good which suffers from the same free rider problem unless it's a toll road. Toll roads can work for things like bridges and some highways, but it can't work for all roads. Imagine if you had to pay a toll every time you left your house to go to the grocery store. Number two, in cases where a perceived competition does exist, the history of privatization has been a complete disaster. For example, the charter school movement was a means by which to create competition within inner city school districts in order to promote better outcomes. The problem is that children do not behave the same way that businesses do when it comes to competitive markets. If they lack resources because the school is being punished due to poor test scores, they don't tend to buckle down and do better. They just get worse. Again, we are faced with an unpleasant and inconvenient truth that we learned in Chapter 5. When private interests fail, it is up to government to correct the externalities. Now we're faced with a new inconvenient truth that when the government fails to address its own fiscal needs, then there isn't anyone left to fix the problems. There are simply no alternatives than government when it comes to dealing with externalities. And when we mix politics into the picture, we often make the problem worse rather than making it better. So, what's the government's answer to this bleak future? Simple. They lie to the American people by telling them that their legitimate concerns are wildly overblown and that everything is gonna get better in the future. They tell us that the economy and fiscal policy is way too complicated for any one of us to understand, so they've got everything under control. Then, when a whistleblower like WikiLeaks comes along with evidence to the contrary, they'll blame it on Russian espionage, or we'll call it a conspiracy theory, or they'll simply shrug their shoulders and say, forget about it. Or worse, when they can no longer ignore the economic realities of a situation, they tell us that it's all our fault, or it's the fault of illegal aliens, immigrants, refugees, foreign governments, Russia and China, and maybe terrorists who want to take away your freedom. The answer to the problem, therefore, is to spend more money on wars of aggression and place greater restrictions on economic activity and limit free speech by attacking and silencing anyone who has an alternative point of view. That ought to do it.